So let me just begin, and I'll just begin by just a quick intro about who I am again. And so I'm an author, journalist, editor, writing coach, and yoga teacher. And so I'm passionate about helping people tell the stories and get the ideas into the world that they feel passionate about sharing, and changing other people's lives through their stories and ideas. So today I want to talk about structure. And, you know, structure is interesting, you know, on a kind of a meta level. It's kind of an amazing thing when we actually define structure, whether it's in our writing or in our lives. Actually, there's a lot of richness can grow from that. When you kind of define the borders that you're working within, then there's a way in which things actually flourish more. When we're unstructured in writing, things get diffuse and get chaotic, and it might feel like there's more freedom in that space, but there's actually less. And so when we actually define the structure of a piece, whether it's an article or whether it's a book, we give opportunities to explore all the nooks and crannies that lie within the territory we're going to cover. So I'm going to begin today by talking about a nonfiction book, and not necessarily a narrative nonfiction book, though. I have many clients that are, I seem to attract therapists as clients, and I've had, a sex therapist. I've had, people who work on, different aspects of therapy, trauma therapy, Enneagram coaches, those kinds of things. And so, so I'm talking about a book of ideas, basically. And even so, the organizing principle in any piece of writing really is the word next. What comes next? And so whether you're working, I'll get to Memoir here before the end, but, even in a book that's not a chronological structure, the organizing principle is what comes next. And so I'll unpack that, but I'll begin here by talking really about, and there's lots of ways to structure things. Let me add to that. I mean, there's complex structures, but I'm going to kind of talk about some of a simpler structure that's kind of a classic structure, and one that is actually even at the root of even more complex structures. And that's basically a 3-act structure. And so with a nonfiction book, even one that's not a narrative, I still, coach people to use a 3-act structure. And so in nonfiction, so say you're writing a book about, your specialty of how you help people, let's just take coaching, for example, your method of coaching and how you help people find more power in their lives. So the 3-act structure I would advise for that kind of a book is, so Act 1 is actually defining the main problem of the book, or main question. And those two words are kind of interchangeable for me. And so Act 1, it could be one chapter, it could be a couple, 2 or 3 chapters, but basically the job to do in the first act of a nonfiction book is to define the main problem you're gonna approach. And so that means actually, setting up, if you are a therapist, for example, the problems that you're going to be helping people with. You notice that people come into your office, and they have these particular problems, and you've created this system to address them. Well, section 1 is simply going deep into defining, the problem that you're going to address. And then by the end of section 1, you kind of hint at that you do have a solution for it. And so you're not going to reveal all your cards there, but you're going to basically define the problem and hint that there is a solution that you've come up with to solve the problem. And again, this can be simply as short as one chapter, or it could be several. It could be, chapter 1 could be really defining the problem. Chapter 2 and 3 could be kind of unpacking that problem in just a little more subtlety and a little more complexity. But then Act 1 ends and Act 2 begins. And Act 2 is sort of trying on different solutions to this problem. And so, in a nonfiction book, Act Two then would begin with the most foundational way that you're going to be thinking about answering or solving the problem. What's the biggest picture version of how your solution that you're offering, and then in keeping with this idea of what comes next, you might have other solutions for it, or you might start to unpack that main solution you've offered in that first chapter of Act Two. In other words, so Act Two is basically trying on different solutions. And so your chapters could be, here's one solution, here's another solution, here's a third solution. It could be simply trying on different solutions literally. It could also be, here's my main solution for this, and I'm going to, in subsequent chapters, show you further breakdowns of how this gets into more complexity. But again, the main driving force again is just asking yourself what comes next. Is what is next a whole other solution, or is it a further breaking down of in complexity of the solution you offered at the beginning of Act Two? And that's the bulk of the book. Act Two is that's I'd say if Act One is say a quarter of the book at the most, Act Two is probably half the book in a way, and then we get to Act Three, and by the end of Act Two, you've presented lots of options and solutions to this problem, and then Act Three is sort of the final act, and it's essentially emphasizing the mindset that you've kind of offered over the course of this first 3/4 of the book. If anything remains unclear, or since you've been breaking things down into further complexity, you want to circle back and kind of reconfirm how you've answered or solved the problem that you proposed in Act One. And often, like I use that word mindset, is you just kind of emphasize, okay, we tried on all these different things, and now here is actually, I'm wrapping up and showing you how this is I did show you a coherent solution to the problem. And there's two other things to be done in Act Three, and one of them is, kind of wrapping things, anything loose ends that are remain, and then also kind of looking forward. And if you do have an idea for a second book, or you could hint at what that second book could be, conceptually at least, if not explicitly saying you have a second book. And also just, what problems remain. I mean, anytime we try to solve a problem, there's always loose ends and things that kind of end on an unsatisfying way. And you might just acknowledge these things that remain still unclear, and still that will need to be addressed in our lives or in future books and discussions. So that's essentially, the format for a nonfiction book. Within that structure, I will spend a couple of minutes offering kind of what's maybe a micro structure for a chapter. And it kind of follows the same a pattern. And so within a nonfiction book like that, you can actually have narrative, smaller stories that are working to help support your ideas in the book. But basically, I do like to think of within chapters, there's still essentially a 3-act structure within the chapter. There's a beginning, a middle, and an end. And I often do coach people to try to write narratively within the chapters. Again, if I'm talking about a therapist book again, and this could work for coaching books or any other kinds of books, many kinds of books itself. But you want to show people, you want to tell stories, and so you'll have stories that might be from your practice. So you have client stories. You might have personal stories about your own journey in life, and then you might even draw from cultural stories or zeitgeist stories, meaning stories that are out in the world that maybe people might identify with. Maybe it's an old myth from years, centuries ago, or maybe it's something from pop culture. But I kind of offer the 3 types of the main stories you might tell in within a chapter of a nonfiction book. Are like stories of how you've helped somebody, personal stories of how you've overcome things, and then stories that are out in the world that might illuminate, could be a movie, could be a book, those kinds of things. So you tell a story, and then you reflect on that. So if you think about, the 3-act structure within a chapter, you might lead with a story from a client or from your own life. And then the second section might be kind of making sense of that story and then pivoting to teach from that story. So the story is really a vehicle for you to the brain loves a story, so it sets up the story. The reader kind of feels into what you're going to try to teach about, but then you explicitly teach from that story. And then the third section, of course, is wrapping up loose ends again, and kind of hinting at what's going to come next. And of course, it doesn't mean you just has to have 3 sections. You can repeat that pattern actually several times within a chapter. But again, it's always best to have that chapter even have a sense of building, even a sense of an arc where the stories are leading to further teachings and further complexity. And then by the end, you're wrapping up loose ends. So that's kind of the micro structure that actually might be for a good class that's in the future to kind of go deeper into. But just to review, I think of a 3-act structure in a nonfiction book: setting up the problem or the question, Act 1. Act 2, trying on different solutions, leaning on what comes logically next. Is it another solution, or is it breaking down a previous solution I said into kind of more micro parts? And then Act 3 is wrapping loose ends up, establishing firmly the mindset you want the reader to really end with and feel at the end, and then looking back and looking forward. So that's a nonfiction book. I'm going to pivot now toward a memoir, and I also advocate essentially a 3-act structure in memoir as well. And again, this idea of what comes next is sort of the driving factor. In a memoir, chronology is sort of the main organizing what comes next, factor. And it doesn't mean necessarily that every chapter has to be structured exactly chronological, because there are many reasons and good reasons, and actually it's very effective to have flashback chapters. And I'll talk about how and why you might place them where. But essentially, chronology is the organizing factor of a memoir. But again, Act 1 is sort of just like with a nonfiction book. Act 1 is defining the main problem or the main question of the book. And one way to think about memoir, and this is another topic as well, but sort of like honing your idea. A good formula for honing your memoir idea is essentially like, my book is about X topic as viewed through the lens of why experiences, particular kinds of experiences in my life. And I'll kind of unpack that, like my book, for example, it's about faith in self and maybe a higher power, as told through or as viewed through the lens of my many travels. And if there's a particular angle in my spiritual seeking in that area too. So my book, for example, this idea of like, it's about faith as seen or viewed through this lens of travel. So as you're working on your own memoir, if you are, try to boil it down. It's really often about an idea first, because that's exactly why people write 3 or 4 memoirs in their lives, because each one is about a different idea, and they choose the stories to tell based on what serves that main idea. So again, Act 1, defining the problem. Only you do this in memoir, you do this through storytelling. And so you basically, in Act 1, you kind of show you struggling with the problem, So for me, it might be struggling with a lack of faith, and maybe I'm kind of banging my head against the wall, and it seems like I've tried everything to kind of grapple with this topic, and nothing has quite worked. And then there's sort of a moment towards the end of section 1 or Act 1 in a memoir where you sort of cross a threshold, or you have a realization that something has to change, and you something happens in your life, or some realization you have, and there's sort of like this way of like, once you see things that way, and you cross that threshold, nothing can ever be the same. And so the final scene of Act One in a memoir is often kind of like this event that kind of pushed you to the limit in this old way of seeing yourself, and you cross over that threshold, and then Act Two begins. And Act Two again is I'll use the same words I use in the nonfiction book, is trying on different solutions. And so we see in kind of a chronological way all the different things you tried to solve the problem. And now you've crossed that threshold, you're on a new journey. You can't go back to being the person you were before. You now see things entirely differently, but now you've got a new journey to be on, and you've got to like, okay, I see the problem. I have enough awareness of the problem now, and now I'm going to go out and try to like really work it through in my life in a way. And this is all told, of course, in the past tense most often, but sometimes in present tense in memoir. And so we see you like, working through your life, drawing on the scenes and the events from your life that are most relevant to the theme that you've proposed in section one, though, right? Because if it's about faith, I'm going to only choose primarily the events of my life that have to do with how I tried to overcome and get to a place of faith. And so, and so often, when we want to write a memoir, we have all these scenes in our mind that we want to include, but a lot of them are going to end up on the cutting room floor, or end up in your second or third memoir, because they don't necessarily feed into the main theme that you've chosen to write about. For me, faith. And so, so whatever your topic is, love or self-love, or fear, overcoming fear, whatever the main problem is, you choose the scenes and the anecdotes and that feed into that theme. And so Act Two, we see a series of attempts to kind of like what you did in your life to try to overcome and to get to this place of faith that you so craved in section one. And then included in section two is sort of a crisis and a climax. And a crisis, essentially is in sort of classic narrative structure is something happens that sends you even deeper than you've ever had to go. I mean, so even you're banging your head against the wall in part one or act one of the thing seemed hard, but you've been on this path to try to find faith, and you've maybe even found faith at various times in the second act, but then something happens and it sends you into maybe total despair in some way. In other words, so that's the crisis. You explore something in a deeper way than you've ever had to do it. And then the climax is, we see something happens that sort of solves that crisis. You get out of the crisis, and the whole book isn't solved yet, but the crisis gets solved in the climax. And that ends Act Two. And Act Three then is what I call, living in the new now. And so, we've been on this journey with you. We went through Act One, where we saw you banging your head against the wall, trying to figure out how to overcome this problem. We followed you through Act Two, all these ways that once you got a little bit of clarity, you tried to solve the problem. And then we arrive in Act Three. We've been through this dramatic crisis and climax, and we are now in a place of like the new now. And there's sort of a mood change often in the new now. And I'd like to kind of propose that it kind of has a bittersweet feel to it, because, you've overcome a lot, and you've actually seen, you solved the problem in a lot of ways. But guess what? This is life. And as the Buddha said, in the first noble truth, life is suffering. And so there's always this kind of taste of melancholy, this taste of unsatisfaction, even as there's the satisfaction of having overcome the problem. And so there's a word, I mean, I sometimes pull in my yoga teaching. There's a Sanskrit word called santosha, which is contentment, and it's something to aspire to have contentment. But in yoga philosophy, contentment comes with a slight flavor of discontent, a slight flavor of acceptance that things will continue to be hard and nothing will ever end up perfect. And so you want to find this balance of positiveness, that you've overcome so much, but you still are left in this human condition that we have. And that's I think those are two useful terms, even though they're Sanskrit. But stories don't end well when they're just wrapped up in neat bows, because we all know that life doesn't work like that. Stuff gets hard, things end, we get sick, we die, all that stuff is real. And so, not to, be a doomsayer, but, the end of your book, your memoir, should kind of reflect this way in which, you've healed a lot, and you're going to have another episode of losing your shit and getting angry again, or you're going to, whatever you're working on, it's going to happen again. And so, so that's section 3, the kind of living in the now. But, and I don't want to overemphasize the negativity of it. There's so much to be said and so much positive about the stuff you've been through, what you've overcome. It just has that tint of, that there's always something around the corner. And so, and often, even books that are told in the past tense can kind of have a feel, even if you write it in the past tense, but you can also shift to present in section 3. And there's just this way of we see you, the main action of the book is over. We might see you, meandering a favorite trail you hike or something, or, we see you, walking through familiar territory, but you have a new way of seeing the world in this section. So know that there's kind of the main drama is over, and there's kind of a casual, lower key, less action happening, a lot more thinking is happening. So you want to have that thinking grounded in action as well. So, but just the main action of the book is over at that point. So, so that's the structure of a memoir. And it's just one structure. And maybe next time I'll go further into different types of structures. One thing about kind of the microstructure within chapters, again, just like a book has an arc, just like a book has rising action and a crisis and climax and a resolution, a chapter should too. And so, just know that you want it to build, stuff gets more tense. There's a crisis, there's a climax, and then there's a resolution. And when I say resolution, within chapters of your memoir, sometimes it works out that you kind of got what you were looking to get in that chapter. Maybe you were looking for more peace, and you arrived there, and you had a positive experience in that chapter. But it doesn't always have to be. Sometimes you can have a negative experience. You tried on this new way of doing things in this chapter, and it failed. It just flat out didn't work, and that's totally acceptable outcome for a chapter, occasionally. And then the third way that a chapter can kind of end is just in a state of confusion and mystery, and even that is good. So just know that there should be kind of like a plus, a minus, or a kind of meh to the end of a chapter, and those are all good. And then finally, you do want chapters to end with cliffhangers, and it doesn't mean you need to actually be in a place of danger, or I'm not saying it's a real cliffhanger, but more of as the chapter ends, you want to kind of make sure the reader turns the page to the next thing, and so you want to say, I'm trying to think if I can make up something on the fly here, but as I close the book on this particular thing I was trying, I knew that, I had some success, but I knew that there was more for me to learn, something like that. I mean, just you want to leave it with that sense that you seed S-E-E-D it with some anticipation for what might come next. In fact, it might even be a more compelling thing that comes next. So you want to kind of create a sense of drama in that way by ending the chapter on a cliffhanger. So, Let me see if there's anything else to mention. That's about all. So any questions today? No worries. If not, it's totally good. Just, if you want to think for a minute. If not, you can always email me with a question, and, happy writing, and feel free to reach out if anything comes up. You want some, and I offer a free 30-minute consults as well. So if you ever want to talk about your writing and with no obligation, I'd love to work with you as a coaching client, but also offer these 30-minute things to help people, find where they are in their writing and try to help them make progress. So thank you for being here.
Thank you. That was very helpful.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Great. I'll see you next week.
Okay.
Bye.
Awesome.